The ice is cold, but the game is colder. What if the fastest run on ice wasn't decided by physics, but by power? At first glance, skeleton and luge look brutally simple. One athlete, one sled, one frozen track. Gravity does the rest. There are no judges holding up scorecards, no referees blowing whistles, no opponents to block or foul. Just speed, steel, and ice. That simplicity is exactly why no one was looking for corruption. But behind the scenes of the Winter Olympics, whispers began to circulate, not about athletes cheating, but about the ice itself, about track conditions subtly altered, about start orders mysteriously favoring certain competitors, about officials whose decisions, invisible to the audience, could shift hundredths of a second. The difference between gold and anonymity. Skeleton and luge are sports decided by margins so small they defy belief. A slightly warmer section of track, a smoother curve, a gate open seconds earlier or later. These aren't dramatic changes, but they are decisive. And in a sport where medals define careers and national pride, those margins are worth everything. The allegations didn't emerge all at once. They leaked out slowly in fragments. A coach muttering about unfair ice. An athlete questioning why track conditions seem to change between runs. A technician quietly admitting that maintenance schedules weren't always neutral. Nothing concrete, nothing provable, but enough to raise eyebrows among those who knew the sport best. Then came the rumors of money. Not direct bribes, not envelopes openly exchanged in daylight, but favors, influence, promises, quiet incentives offered to officials who controlled the unseen variables of competition. The kinds of decisions that don't show up on television broadcasts, but live deep in technical manuals and operational protocols. Track temperature, ice preparation timing, lane assignments, practice access, start order, each one small, each one legal on paper. Together, potentially devastating. National pressure added fuel to the fire. Winter Olympic medals are political currency. They validate sports programs, justify funding, and elevate countries on the global stage. When a nation invests millions into sliding sports facilities and athlete development, expectations follow. And expectations, when unmet, create pressure that doesn't always stay within ethical boundaries. Behind closed doors, officials carried enormous power, with minimal oversight. Skeleton and luge lack the intense judging scrutiny of figure skating or the constant camera angles of alpine skiing. Much of the sport's integrity rested on trust. Trust that officials were neutral. Trust that conditions were equal. Trust that gold was earned, not engineered. That trust would soon be tested, as podiums repeated familiar flags, as favored athletes delivered perfect runs under suspiciously ideal conditions, as rivals struggled on tracks that felt different, slower, rougher, less forgiving. The question wasn't whether manipulation was possible. It was whether anyone would ever be able to prove it. If the ice itself could be weaponized, who was really racing, the athletes or the system controlling the track? How much would you pay to shave time off a race where a medal is decided by blinking? In skeleton and luge, the margin between victory and obscurity isn't measured in seconds. It's measured in breaths, hundreds, sometimes thousands. A microscopic difference in ice texture, a slightly altered temperature, or a subtly adjusted start order can quietly reshape the podium without anyone in the stands realizing what just happened. That reality is what turned suspicion into obsession. Athletes began comparing notes in hushed conversations long after cameras stopped rolling. They spoke about tracks that felt dead one day and fast the next, about corners that suddenly bit harder, about ice that behaved differently depending on who was sliding and when. None of this could be proven with a stopwatch alone, but the patterns felt wrong. Coaches noticed it too. Veteran coaches, the kind who had walked dozens of tracks across multiple Olympics, started questioning maintenance schedules, ice resurfacing times that didn't align with published plans, track temperatures drifting just enough to favor heavier sleds or more aggressive steering styles, adjustments that were technically within regulations, but strategically devastating. And then there was the order of runs. Start order is everything in sliding sports. Early runs often enjoy cleaner ice. Later athletes face grooves, ruts, and imperfections carved by those who went before them. On paper, the order followed rules. In practice, exceptions quietly appeared. Weather delays, operational adjustments, decisions justified as logistical necessities, but always landing the same way, favoring the same countries, the same athletes, the same flags on the podium. This is where motive entered the picture. For smaller nations, a single Winter Olympic medal can define an entire generation of sport. Funding flows where medals go. Political leaders point to podiums as proof of national excellence. Careers are built not just for athletes, but for administrators, coaches, and federation officials who can claim success. That kind of pressure creates incentives, and incentives invite shortcuts. But bribery in this world didn't look like a movie scene. No obvious cash exchanges in locker rooms. No paper trails leading directly to officials' bank accounts. Instead, it lived in favors. Paid consulting roles after the games. Travel accommodations quietly upgraded. Equipment contracts steered in certain directions. Promises of future influence within federations. The currency wasn't always money. Sometimes it was access. Sometimes career security. Sometimes the simple assurance of remaining powerful in a sport where power is rarely questioned. Officials controlling track preparation sat at the center of it all. These were not celebrities. They didn't give interviews. Their names rarely appeared in headlines. Yet they controlled ice temperature, maintenance timing, and track readiness. Variables that could subtly tilt the competitive field without ever violating a single written rule. And because skeleton and luge lacked subjective judging, suspicion paradoxically grew stronger. If athletes lost, there was no judge to blame, only the track. And the track officially never lies. But athletes do, and so do systems. The risk for anyone attempting manipulation was enormous. Exposure could mean bans, strip medals, international disgrace. Yet the reward, Olympic gold, carried a gravity that bent ethical lines. For some, the calculation was simple. The system trusted them completely. Oversight was minimal. Whistleblowers were rare and easily dismissed as sore losers. Silence became protection. Those who questioned conditions risked being labeled difficult, paranoid, unprofessional. In elite sport, reputation matters almost as much as results. To accuse the system is to threaten your own future. And so suspicion spread quietly, not in press conferences, but in late-night hotel conversations. Not in official complaints, but in body language at the start gate. Eyes lingering on officials. Athletes watching the ice more closely than the clock. The tension became suffocating, because everyone knew the truth might never surface. There were no cameras embedded beneath the ice. No public logs of minute-by-minute track adjustments. No independent oversight body verifying neutrality in real time. The system relied on trust, and trust, once cracked, doesn't shatter loudly. It erodes, and erosion is dangerous. If suspicion alone was enough to poison the competition, what would happen if someone finally spoke up and forced the system to look at itself? What happens when a sport built on silence is finally forced to explain itself? Investigations in elite winter sports don't begin with police sirens or courtroom subpoenas. They begin with discomfort, with patterns that won't disappear, with questions that refuse to stay buried. For skeleton and luge, the pressure reached a tipping point when murmurs turned into documentation. It started quietly, as it always does. A coach filed a technical inquiry, not an accusation. An athlete requested clarification on track preparation protocols. A federation asked for maintenance logs, citing competitive consistency. None of these were explosive on their own, but together, they formed a trail that officials could no longer ignore. The problem? The system wasn't built for transparency. Track conditions were managed by a tight inner circle. Ice technicians, race directors, and event officials whose decisions were logged in fragmented ways, if at all. Records existed, but they were scattered, some handwritten, some digital, some inexplicably missing. When requests came in, responses were slow, delayed, carefully worded. That alone raised alarms. Independent analysts, often former athletes or engineers, began studying run data more closely. Split times, speed differentials, environmental conditions. What they found wasn't definitive proof, but it was unsettling. Certain athletes consistently benefited from faster track segments during critical runs. Not always, not dramatically, just enough to matter. Journalists caught wind. Sliding sports rarely attract investigative reporters, but controversy is magnetic. Once a single outlet published a piece questioning fairness in track conditions, others followed. Headlines didn't accuse, they implied. And implication is dangerous because it invites scrutiny without protection. Officials responded with rehearsed confidence. All conditions were within regulation. Ice preparation followed standard procedures. No evidence of favoritism exists. But here's the problem. Regulation doesn't equal neutrality. Rules allowed flexibility, temperature ranges, maintenance windows, discretionary decisions justified by weather, safety, or scheduling. Those gray areas, once considered practical necessities, now looked like vulnerabilities. Behind closed doors, internal reviews were launched. These weren't criminal investigations. They were administrative, controlled, limited, and designed to protect the sport as much as uncover the truth. Emails were examined, logs reviewed, interviews conducted quietly, without press present. Some officials cooperated fully, others didn't. One technician admitted that ice preparation timing could advantage certain sled styles. Another acknowledged that pressure from above influenced scheduling decisions, though they stopped short of naming names. A race official described being encouraged to prioritize smoothness before specific runs. Encouraged by whom? That question hung unanswered. Whistleblowers, when they appeared, faced immediate backlash. Their credibility was attacked, their motives questioned. They were framed as bitter, unsuccessful, or politically motivated. In elite sport, exposing wrongdoing often means exile, and everyone knows it. Still, cracks widened. International federations were forced to address the issue publicly. Committees promised reforms. Task forces were announced. Oversight language entered press releases. But none of it confirmed guilt. The goal wasn't justice, it was stabilization. Because proving manipulation is almost impossible. You can't replay the ice. You can't recreate conditions exactly. You can't isolate intent from coincidence. And those who might know the truth best had every reason to stay silent. Yet, the exposure changed something fundamental. Athletes stopped trusting the track. Coaches stopped trusting officials. Fans stopped assuming fairness. Once doubt enters a sport defined by precision, the damage is existential. Medals were still awarded. Podiums still photographed. National anthems still played. But beneath the celebration was an unspoken question that no investigation could fully answer. Was this real? If proof could never be absolute, could accountability ever exist? Or would the truth always slide just out of reach? If you can't trust the ice, what's an Olympic medal really worth? The fallout from the skeleton and luge bribery allegations didn't arrive in a single explosive moment. There were no mass arrests, no dramatic medal reallocations, no officials led away in handcuffs. Instead, the damage spread quietly, and in some ways, that made it worse. Because unresolved suspicion lingers longer than proven guilt. Athletes who stood on the podium carried their medals with a new weight. Not heavier, emptier. For some, the celebration was followed not by endorsement deals or national adoration, but by sideways glances and whispered questions. Gold became conditional. Achievements were framed with a caveat. But were the conditions fair? For those who lost, especially by razor-thin margins, the consequences were brutal. Olympic windows are short. Many skeleton and luge athletes get one shot, maybe two, before age, injury, or Funding closes the door. To believe that your moment was stolen not by skill, but by manipulated ice, is a psychological wound that never fully heals. Some retired early. Some spiraled into bitterness. Some never spoke publicly, because speaking wouldn't change anything. National federations felt the pressure next. Funding bodies demanded reassurance. Governments asked uncomfortable questions. How could millions be poured into programs if the competitive field wasn't truly level? Public trust matters, especially in sports that already struggle for mainstream attention. Sliding sports couldn't afford scandal, and yet, scandal had found them anyway. Reforms followed. International federations introduced stricter documentation protocols. Ice preparation logs became more detailed. Oversight committees were expanded. Third-party observers were added to major events. Track conditions were monitored more closely. Temperatures logged more consistently. Maintenance windows standardized. On paper, it looked like progress. In reality, it was damage control. None of the reforms admitted past wrongdoing. They were framed as enhancements, not corrections. The language was careful, almost surgical. The goal wasn't to confess, it was to prevent future accusations. And maybe that was enough. Or maybe it wasn't. Because the deeper consequence wasn't procedural, it was philosophical. Skeleton and luge lost their illusion of purity. They were no longer just gravity sports where physics ruled all. They became sports where human influence, quiet, technical, deniable, could shape outcomes without ever touching the sled. That realization changed how fans watched, how athletes trained, and how officials operated. Trust, once cracked, never fully reseals. The allegations also reshaped how future scandals were perceived. When other Olympic controversies emerged, judging disputes, doping revelations, eligibility violations, sliding sports were no longer immune. The question wasn't, could this happen here, anymore. It was, has it already happened? And perhaps the most chilling effect was this: no one truly knows how much was real. Maybe the manipulation was exaggerated. Maybe favoritism was incidental, not intentional. Maybe gold was still earned fairly more often than not. But sport doesn't survive on maybe. It survives on belief. And belief requires transparency, not just rules, but accountability. Today, skeleton and luge continue. Athletes still race. Records still fall. Medals still shine under bright lights. But somewhere beneath the ice, the memory of those allegations remains frozen in place. A reminder that even in the coldest, fastest sports on Earth, corruption doesn't need heat to grow. It just needs silence. If the system was capable of manipulation, even once, how many victories will forever live with an asterisk?